Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Chris Dunstan, and I apologise for delaying the start of this session by asking a convoluted question at the end of the last one. That was rookie error. So I'm Adjunct Associate Professor at Institute for Sustainable Futures here at UTS, and today's session on decarbonisation pathways, research, policy and practice. So we've got some excellent speakers. I'll get straight into it. So our first speaker is Dylan McConnell, who's a Senior Research Associate at University of New South Wales. His details, as for all of the speakers, are spelt out in the conference program. So in the interest of giving more time to our speakers and for you to ask a few questions, we'll get straight into it. For each of the speakers, we have 10 minutes for the presentation and hopefully a couple of minutes for a question each time. And if we're really prompt, then hopefully there'll be a little bit of time for discussion at the end, but we'll see how we go, particularly as it's a later start. So with that, can I please call on Dylan to join us, and please welcome Dylan for his presentation.
All right. Yes. Thanks, Chris. And if you do happen to want to look me up in the book, you might be surprised to see a different photo there. So this is what I look like. Anyway, yeah, a pleasure to be here today. Yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit about building on some work and analysis I did a few years ago, actually, looking at the industrial organisation of the sector, and actually, quite helpfully, so if you visited Bruce's presentation yesterday, or even Ian's just a moment ago, that will perhaps help with my presentation, because there's certainly degrees of overlap there. Yeah, so basically, when I was first looking at this probably about two and a half years ago, there was what at the time preliminary indications that things were perhaps moving in a different direction, let's say. These are things like the UNGI scheme, the various RETs, the various SoERC 2.0, various government interventions, and these things that don't typically sit with your liberalised, deregulated electricity market kind of model. And yeah, since then, these interventions have only really increased, as we saw a fantastic laundry list of those from Bruce yesterday. And yeah, I think that there's sort of, what was the phrase, the state governments have taken the bulls by the horn, or something like to that effect. And I think we've decidedly moved in that last 2 to 3 year period further in that direction of a more interventionist and less market-oriented approach. So yes, the industrial organisation of the sector has or is shifting, or has perhaps already fundamentally shifted. And I think it's fair to say that it's not just happening here, it's happening in various other countries, that sort of rejection of the laissez-faire free market electricity market model is certainly questioned or under question. I think Ian made mention of this in his previous talk. And yeah, there's a lot of question marks around whether or not marginal cost pricing will work, whether or, there's the theoretical practicalities of that, but there's also the political and real world political economies of making that work, which are, I guess, two separate things. And yeah, this change in organisational structure has not particularly been changed by a commensurate change in the governance arrangements and the institutional structures that underpin the sector, and that's kind of more what I want to focus on in this presentation. And so, to be clear, what I'm not talking about, the expansion of renewable energy and the decline of coal and all that sort of. I'm talking about the relations between, how firms participate in systems, what their motivations and drivers are. That sort of organisational, industrial organisation. Sort of to actually refer back to Ben Barr, I was quite encouraged to hear him say yesterday it is a boring topic. I think he said, you know, we need to see innovation in the institutional space as well, and that was something I was heartened to hear. And I also happen to agree that it is a rather boring topic in the scheme of the excitement of the energy transition as well. But I think an important one. I think it's quite important to sort of maintain legitimacy, and you know, if we're going to actually maintain this just transition, then actually having a fit for purpose and appropriate governance framework underpinning that is actually quite important. So there's a lot on this slide. Don't worry about all the details. This is just it's actually an incomplete list. I think the full list I have is, I think, 9 or 10 different organisational structures that are common around the world, and it's probably important to point out that these are not exclusive. These are definitely mixed. You know, these exist in mixed economies. You have you know, regulated. You have public or government enterprise. Even in Australia, you have government-owned enterprises existing within deregulated electricity markets, and you have you know, independent power producers interacting with public utilities in, say, the United States and so on. So they're not exclusively. There's a mix, but I think it's fair to say that we have seen this a bit of a move towards a less laissez-faire, less deregulated market approach to a more sort of public utility, government-owned, well, certainly government-owned enterprise approach, or direct. In the case of the New South Wales energy infrastructure, we have direct contracting with private companies. So that's sort of similar to that independent power producer model that is more common in the United States. But anyway, so we're sort of moving. And I think the point of this is not to exhaustively, because there's a lot of nuance that's not captured in this as well. But you know, to understand that there are quite a few different organisational structures, and there are different governance structures that are suited to those organisational structures. And we're moving one without necessarily moving the other. So anyway, to go back to where we're starting from, and the existing, framework is that you know, the idea was that we'd be governed by a highly prescriptive set of rules, and that market participants would have you know, sufficient trusting to make long-term investment decisions over long-term horizons. And these rules would be, underpinned by arrangements that supported the efficient development of those in a very consistent and understood way, so it wouldn't affect you know, investment decisions. It was almost slow by design. Like that was actually an intention in a way. And so the logic for this, a part of this was also have strict separation between different actors as well. So strict separation from the market operator and the lawmaker and governments and other stakeholders. And this strict separation was basically seen as essential to maintaining investor confidence in these long-lived investment assets. You know, we're talking 20-plus year investments, and being at the whims the political whims of the day is a problem if you're trying to get the private sector to do this investment. So trying to avoid these conflicts of interest was a key driver, which is actually you know, in the original specifications from the National Electricity Code from 1996. It's like we need to keep these separate. Sorry, is that a bit better? Okay. Now, so alongside that, we have these. We have the institutions that were set up around that. I won't talk too much about those just at the moment, but that they were basically set up under these principles. Now, since then, and referring back to both Ian and Bruce's presentation, we've had lots of direct interventions in the electricity market. We've also had a re-emergence of what might be called place-based industry policy, not just in Australia, but internationally as well. We have the Investment Reduction Act in America. We have the Green Industrial Deal in the European Union. We also have these other policies like Rewiring the Nation, Corporation, integrated regional development has become more of a thing that needs to be thought about in the context of Sorry. So yeah, and I actually think it was quite funny yesterday to hear we had Ben Barr, talking about the need for more further research to inform the, an evidence-based rule, development process, and sort of talking about, this old. It's sort of almost a manifestation of these two separate slides. You have the old approach, and then next, or just prior to him, you had the actual energy minister saying, "Hey, we're investing in this. It's going to be great." And it was almost like they were talking past each other a little bit, or at least the real politics, or what's actually happening on the ground was quite separate to what Ben Barr was perhaps talking about. So yeah, and then alongside this change, there's also been evolutions of institutions that I would argue have not been useful or have potentially been counterproductive. And one of those is the addition of the Energy Security Board, a result of the Finkel recommendations, and this actually instituted a relationship that the original designers of the NEM explicitly tried to prevent, namely, putting together rulemaker and operator within the same organisation. We also have conflicting roles. We have multiple rulemakers. Both AMC and ESB technically have rulemaking capabilities under the somewhat controversial Section 90F part of the ESB's. Part of the National Electricity Law, also somewhat in contradiction to the Vertican Review recommendations, and actually the Edwards Review of the ESB itself from 2020 actually recommended that these powers be reduced and the ESB be fundamentally restructured to basically be more of a market bodies forum rather than having these overlapping functions. And the other big change has been the addition, well, the increase of the role of planning and the supremacy of, well, the role of AEMO in the development of the market, which is definitely a move from the sort of historical role that it's played in that space. And there's a broader question. There's the broader question about the overarching institutional framework and governance structure for the whole sector. But there's actually a specific question about those questions for AEMO and whether or not that's actually fit for purpose in a role where they are actually playing that more planning role. And these are things about their ownership structure and so on. I'm getting the wind up, so yes. At risk of, this is a bit of what's a Bettridge's Law question. Whenever you have a question like this in a headline, the answer is always no. I'm not sure we actually need, it's not clear we do or don't need a new market agreement, but I think we do need to acknowledge that the current institutional arrangement doesn't actually match up with what's happening, and perhaps we need to clarify roles and responsibilities. And consider, I didn't get to talk a little much on this, but the whole cooperative federalist approach, whether or not that's working or not, or whether or not it can or should work, and then some perhaps more speculative things about, abolishing the ESB, actually listening to the recommendations of various reviews and other people, and potentially splitting the AEMO into an operational part and a sort of planning part, which there is precedent for. That's the nationalisation of the planning part of UK Grid happened about 2 years ago, I think, and that could be a thing that's worth considering here. Anyway, sorry I rushed through a lot of that towards the end there, and please come and ask me questions if you want.
Don't go away, Dylan, because I'll see if we might have time for at least one question. If there's anyone who's got a burning question they want to put to Dylan.
I can ask a quick question, Dylan. Thanks for the presentation.
Alexander, just let people know who you are.
Alexander Kimmel, Griffith University. You haven't mentioned anything about other states except the eastern states, Western Australia and things like that. Do you see any kind of better integration of their regulatory functions into national ones, or you just focusing on eastern states?
Yeah, so I guess, well, when talking about the national electricity market, it's important to remember it's neither national or a market. But yeah, I guess I have been focusing on those states, and that's yeah. I don't have a good reason to say why other than that's what I study.
Thanks, Dylan. I know Ian wanted to ask a question, but if you could save that until the end, hopefully we'll get an opportunity to have a bit of a discussion. So please thank Dylan for his presentation. Okay, our next speaker is Shell Lyons. Shell is a Sir Roland Wilson PhD scholar at Australian National University. Shell has over a decade of experience working in international and domestic climate change policy for the Australian government and elsewhere internationally. Her PhD research examines the role of public financial institutions, particularly green banks, which is what she's going to be talking to us today about on the topic of, in the vault, the role of green banks in accelerating investment in the net zero transition with a number of case studies. So please welcome Shell.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Great. All right. Well, welcome. Welcome. I clearly need more coffee. I came up from Canberra this morning, so I was on the 6 a.m. bus. I'm going to be talking to you today about the PhD research that I'm doing, as mentioned, I'm a public servant, so I take a very applied focus in the research that I'm doing. And so I'm looking at green banks, which are a relatively new type of public institution. And Australia, some of you may not know, has the world's largest green bank, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. But there are a number of other green banks that have been springing up around the world over the past decade. And so I'm doing some case studies looking at Australia, New Zealand and the United States. So for those of you who might not be familiar with green banks, they're a particular type of institution that takes public finance and then leverages in private sector finance to co-invest, and they accelerate sort of investments in sort of renewable energy, low emissions or energy efficient technology. And so they really do sort of three core things. They make those investments, they leverage in that private finance, and then they can deliver a range of co-benefits and public goods. Sorry, let's skip over that. So that was what a green bank is. So my case studies, I'm looking at 4 different green banks. So Australia's Clean Energy Finance Corporation, New Zealand's National Green Bank, NZGIF, the New York Green Bank, and then a county level green bank in the United States, Montgomery County Green Bank. And the reason for doing that was to see, are there differences in the way that these sorts of institution operates? What are the commonalities? Obviously there's huge difference in sort of the monetary scale, the types, the portfolio sort of leverage ratio in terms of, and then their emissions reductions and the sectors that they're targeting. But there are also a lot of very important commonalities in the approach that these different institutions take as well. So green banks work at the very last phase of the innovation cycle, and it's important to kind of note that so the CEFC works quite closely with ARENA, that's more in that R&D phase, but what they do is they take technologies that are ready to be commercialised and they start helping to deploy those at scale. So it's quite unusual for green banks to be deploying new types of technologies. They might be taking technologies that have been deployed overseas and deploying them for the first time in Australia. But where green banks really innovate is in the way that they structure the finance, or how they structure the finance of their technologies. So they're financial innovators. So my paper is looking at whether or not public green banks have catalysed additional solar investments in the jurisdictions profiled. As a policymaker, that's one of the holy grails. It's also very difficult to sort of prove in terms of counterfactuals. And then the other sort of dimension of my research in this paper is looking at how public green banks evaluate the value of their investments. Because, as we sort of start to implement this transition to net zero emissions, the evaluation of investments is going to be really critical to getting it right. And I mean, that's not just the case with, biodiversity markets and all kinds of markets around the world which are kind of coming under increasing scrutiny. It's thinking about, whether we're actually capturing the full value of public investments beyond, the money, the dollars that are committed, beyond the emissions reductions, but actually capturing some of the other public benefits and co-benefits of investment more effectively. So the research is hoping to expand, the very limited literature that exists today on green banks. There's actually only a few sort of articles, one that looks at Australia's CEFC in comparison to Germany's KfW and the UK Green Bank, which was actually privatised in 2017 and sold off to Macquarie. It provides the first sort of comparative case study of green banks in the literature to our knowledge. So it looks at national, state and local level green banks and how the differences and similarities in the way that they operate. And it takes the first steps in exploring how green banks evaluate evaluate the effectiveness of investments to make sure that they are actually capturing the full value of their investment. So methodologically, it takes a qualitative, inductive case study approach. I've done a number of interviews, and one of the great advantages, I think, of being a public servant is that, people are quite comfortable speaking to you because they know that you'll be very risk averse and you'll triple, quadruple check any quotes before they go to publication. So I have been extremely lucky in my sample. I've been able to speak to, 3 CEOs of various green banks. I've been able to speak to numerous senior public servants and numerous sort of senior executives. So the quality of the interview data has been really exciting to me. It's also, as a public servant, getting the opportunity to go and talk to all of these people in across the world in different jurisdictions has been really, really interesting. So. At the moment, I would say the one weakness with the sample is that, it doesn't actually have as many clients as I would like. And so, it's all very well to talk to green banks about what they think they're doing, but it's also important to get, the co-investors' perspective, the client's perspective, and, ideally some of the people that haven't been funded by green banks to see whether, they think they're actually making that difference. So still working to round that out. So then, I think some of the early results, I think the CEFC has definitely been like an integral player in scaling up large-scale solar. The qualitative data I've had from interviewees have said, that, as the statement there says, it gives the CEFC have given investors confidence. They've de-risked investments in the way that they've structured the financial transactions, but they've also led the way and shown, how to actually make these investments, and the commercial sectors then followed. And I think the second quote out there actually sort of gives a bit of insight into the sort of advantage that public green banks have over private commercial firms. They work so closely with government and they have access to so many technical specialists within governments. They actually perform quite a different and a unique role to other financing institutions. And so I think this research shows that there's a real case for, governments developing public green banks to help, accelerate the transition in various sectors. So just finishing off, the 3 kind of key conclusions that I would say is that firstly, evaluating effectiveness of green bank investments is extremely complex, and, actually establishing, the additionality of investments is very, very hard to do. And it's that classic, what is the counterfactual type of case? But, that's not to say that it shouldn't be done. That evaluation is critical to a successful net zero transition. The second finding, which was really interesting, was, that the traditional binary conception that public servants especially have of crowding in and crowding out finance, that you're either, pushing someone out or not, is actually much more complex in reality. That all of the green banks I spoke to said, that they needed to make investments, the riskier investments they made had lower leverage ratios, so they'd be, taking half of that investment to do a first-of-a-kind technology. But for, some of the more commercial applications, they'd have a much higher leverage ratio. And they actively work to get a balance of leverage ratios across their investment portfolios, and that was a really, integral kind of part of their success. And then I guess the final conclusion is that, public green banks are different to, other types of public financial institutions leveraging private finance. They operate in a different space to other types of state investment banks, and that they are a really important tool in the toolkit to transition to net zero. And, the next phase of my research is really thinking about, well, could we deploy the green bank model in other jurisdictions in the Pacific and Southeast Asia? How would you do that? How would the governance need to change? So, I'll leave it there because I think I'm pretty much at time, and happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Shell. Don't go away. You're not just on time, you're ahead of time. So that gives us a chance for a couple of questions. So if you could, again, please use the microphone for a question, then let us know who you are.
Hello, my name is Sophie. I'm from the University of Sydney. I'm really interested in that last point you talked about public green banks in other jurisdictions. Southeast Asia and the Pacific is actually where I work. I don't know much about Australia. Yeah. But my question is specifically about the kind of administrative work of blended finance. And this is the holy grail of paying for stuff all over the world, all of this doing stuff that everyone's been talking about. But it also takes a huge amount of work, and a lot of the benefits are actually for the investors. So I'm just wondering whether you're trying to think about what the costs are for the public of seeking out private investors in what the state could actually just pay for itself in terms of the distributional benefits of that administrative work, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And I think, yes, with all of these things, there is a huge trade-off between, the costs and the benefits. So I think, in the Pacific and the Asia-Pacific context, it's interesting, thinking about the deployment firstly because, in Australia we have a mature, liquid financial market where you have easy access to capital, and the same is true of New York and Montgomery County, and to a lesser extent New Zealand. They don't have quite as much capital, they often have to get it from overseas. But yeah, once you start moving into Asia and the Pacific, it's much harder to do that. I think, that question of increasing state ownership is a really live one, and it's not one that I'm focused on entirely in my research. As a climate negotiator and climate finance person, I would say the actual scale of finance we need is so enormous that it's not going to be possible to do it entirely with public, finance, and so there is going to need to be private finance used in some way. But I agree with you that current mechanisms for blending finance can be overly complex, and they haven't necessarily been that successful to date. So I think now is the time for policymakers and academics alike to be thinking of really innovative financial models that actually, do that more effectively. And one of the things that I'm thinking about in the context of the Pacific is, well, could you have a green bank where you actually have the finance that that kicks off the green bank then becoming sovereign Pacific finance that gives a huge incentive for Pacific countries to get those first investments right. So yeah, happy to talk more about that in the break.
Okay, Shell, we might leave it there so we can move on. So please thank Shell for the presentation. I note that we did start a bit late, so with your permission, I'll crib 10 minutes from the lunch break at the end, if you've got more questions there. If you need to go, we understand. So moving on, our next speaker is Associate Professor Alexander Akimov. Alexander is Associate Professor in Finance and Director of the Sustainable Energy Policy Cluster at Griffith University. He's got a PhD in Financial Economics. He's got a luminous resume. You can read more there. And Alexander will be speaking about Australian regulatory and policy frameworks ready for a DER-led energy transition. Welcome, Alexander.
Right. Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you everyone for attending the session. Look, I'll tell you a bit of a story for this specific topic. So this topic came out as part of RESTO 2030 CRC project, which we have done under the leadership of Curtin University last year. And my task in that project was quite specific, and that was to describe, document, and potentially analyze the regulatory framework, whether the framework is ready for distributed energy resources, led energy transition. So I took on the challenge, even though I'm not a regulatory economist, and yeah, it was much more daunting task than I was predicting at that time. So quite a challenging, and I sort of reflecting what Douglas talked about, the governance of energy in Australia and in eastern states as well, sort of shows the complexity of regulatory framework we have. Part of it, of course, is because of sheer distances we have in Australia and lengths of the systems we have, but also because of sort of state, federal system of governance. But you know, some other things, as Douglas mentioned, may need some revisions and make it a bit more efficient and easier. What's the motivation? So we know that DR has kicked in quite dramatically in recent years, and you know, we have regulators have to deal with that, and it's a sort of catch-up game most of the time. So coming back to the history, so we had the electricity market liberalizations end of 20th century, early 21st century, and we sort of set up principles of policy reform, which sort of led to a certain common denominator with overcapacities, flow changes in production technologies, and pretty much no household electricity production. So now we are facing radical change, and how we deal with that is the big question. All right, so looking back at the history and whether we had similar sort of regulatory challenges in the past, sort of I found some references in relation to US, where they were trying to liberalize sort of state-owned natural monopolies, predominantly things like a railway and ports and airports, and they found, you know, there was lots of discussion that there's no point of creating competition there because it's a natural monopoly. But destruction came to railway industry from other modes of transport. So there's a parallels of what DRR makes to the current system we've got. Basically, competition came from somewhere we haven't expected it to be. Let me jump in the interest of time straight to, you know, why DR is important and how we should sort of look at the themes which require a successful DR transition. So Finkel report back in 2017 outlined a few important benefits of DR, things like reduced costs, carbon abatement, and in theory better quality power, even though there's sort of debatable that in practice has been quite a challenge. Opportunity to have backup power, and also reducing system peak loads. So, you know, solar panels and wind partially as well have the capacity to reduce peak demand in certain places. So there's the graph for it, how it happened in Queensland. You know, without roofs, you know, with rooftop solar, the peak would be earlier time and the bigger, but because solar was sort of shaved off a little bit and moved the peak time to a later time. There have been plenty of regulatory initiatives in Australia around DER. So most notable one is the Energy Security Board's post-2025 market design report, and there were sort of themes on how DR transition should be handled. So there were a few groups in that transition. Particular focus was customer protection, market operations, system security, and network development. there are a few areas which are not explicitly addressed, but hopefully it will be, as a part of the plan to try to follow this market design paper. The segment of this paper, because I had colleagues in Curtin as well, was to look how Western Australia is handling DR reform as well. So we sort of discussed the opportunities for DR in every segment of energy production and consumption, and that's the regulatory environment in Western Australia, which is sort of dominated by the local institution with some roles of national bodies as well. So partially we can say that they have advanced a little bit more in terms of DR reform. They set up Western Australia Energy Transformation Task Force and prepared a regulatory reform agenda in form of DR roadmap. So they have been advanced a little bit more in that case. So moving to crux of the paper and just talk about themes in regulatory environment, which came out with a discussion with industry partners and reading the literature. So one theme is the things like competitiveness, reserve capacity, supply reliability, and price signals. So when we're talking about reserve capacity, obviously it's something which has been trialed at Swiss, and the regulatory changes will need to work a little bit harder in terms of integration, aggregation of DRRs in the wholesale market. So there has been some movements around it, and we know there has been discussion about reserve capacity mechanism in the eastern states as well. So there's some work to be done in that space. There are issues related to distribution, export and import tariffs, and roof-toll subsidies. Obviously, we know that feed-in tariffs have been used quite extensively as the policy mechanism to make an uptake of solar panels. So what's happening now? We've got solar panels are much cheaper and they're competitive without any subsidies. But whether policymakers should be looking at the subsidies elsewhere, such as batteries, is a matter of debate. So here's some stats on household solar PV uptake in different states. Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia were leading the pack, but Western Australia is catching up very, very quickly, so it won't be surprising if they take over soon. Some sort of impact of the solar uptake. Famous duck curve, which is prevalent in the system. We've got the final demand, power system demand, and net demand with existing VRR, but also there's a simulated net demand if we use 50% VRR in the system. So the issue of minimum demand and sort of duck curve is getting worse. So there's another example of the duck curve problem where you compare dynamics, how it looked like over the years from 2016 to 2022, and in particular if you look at the Sundays in 2022, so you can see that the issue is even more prevalent. There are a few other issues. I'll be trying to wrap up quickly. One issue was related to metering and DRA installation and technical standards. So we heard about this in the morning. Gabriella from Smart Energy Council mentioned that. So they have to be revised and got up to scratch. There's a debate about the new emerging business models which would fit into DRR-led world, and the roles of various business models and players, how it's the obstacles for those businesses can be removed and their presence is encouraged. A few more issues like DRI curtailment and support for low-income households, which we also had discussed in the morning. And then more generally, regulation of electricity utilities. So whether the system with RAP and things like that is the most efficient one or some sort of performance-based, incentive-based mechanisms can be devised to regulate them better. So I'll conclude now. So the regulatory framework in Australian sector follows similar evolution to those other developing countries. We know it's a huge country and the regulatory framework is very complex. So what we're likely to expect, there has been a series of reports which pushing us to the DR-led transition, but we don't know where it will end up with. So finally, a bit of my prediction. So regulatory changes are happening, but take into account the important stakeholders in the system. It's likely that it will happen gradually and slower than some would have liked it, because those influential stakeholders have to be adapted to the new working environment. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexander. I'll take one quick question if we have one. For Alexander? Yep.
Owen Pascoe from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Just calling into the previous conversations too, who do you think should have responsibility to resolve these issues for DER that you're seeing?
Well, it's. I think we can ask Dylan and equally talk on the same thing. So, well, there are various setups you can have around it, but perhaps stronger effort from energy AMC perhaps would be warranted. But again, I don't have a ready-made solution for this. So.
Okay. Thanks, Alexander, and we'll see you back at the panel in a moment. Please thank Alexander. Our fourth speaker in the session today is Danny Alexander. I've been very fortunate to have worked with Danny for quite a few years now. Danny is a research director at the Institute for Sustainable Futures, UTS. She's also the program leader for Race for Business at Race for 2030 CRC. Danny's research specialises in energy system flexibility with a focus on DER, both on demand and the supply side, and she's led a number of major research projects in this space. So with that, please welcome Danny Alexander.
Thank you, Chris. And as Chris mentioned, I have a couple of hats, but today I'm here on behalf of Race for 2030 CRC as the Race for Business program leader to talk to you about our vision of a customer-centred clean energy transition. It is on behalf of the team, and so I will endeavour to do the best I can to present on behalf of a great group of people. Our Race for 2030 is reliable, affordable, clean energy. You've heard from John a couple of times in our session, and we were established in July of 2020. So we're about 2.5 years old, and our goal is to undertake high impact research. So the good work that you do and have been presenting at this conference is definitely what we're about and what we're hoping to support into the future. Today I'll be talking a little bit about what we have done to date, but also what we plan to do in the future and how you as Australian researchers, the leaders in your field, can get involved. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal and the Wangal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the country where we are here today, where I live and work, but I'd also acknowledge that we do come from all over Australia, and in fact Race for 2030 is also a virtual organisation and is based around Australia as well. So I recognise those people's continuing connection to the land and waters of their place and this place, and acknowledge that they never ceded sovereignty. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all First Nations people present here today and online. I would also like to acknowledge Chris Dunstan, whose tireless work over the last decade and even before has been a huge part of the success of Race for 2030 to date. I'd like to draw your attention to In the Balance, which is his PhD, Electricity, Sustainability and Least Cost Competition. Again, as I said yesterday, Chris was making it cool before it was cool when Lynn Gallagher said it yesterday. And I'd encourage you to read that. And if you're interested in the backbone, the logic behind our research program to date, I would encourage you to reach out to him. It's a fantastic piece of work, and we're lucky to be able to be building on that today. So thank you, Chris. Today I'll be discussing Race for 2030, what we've done today, some new projects that we are starting in case they dovetail with your interests, but also other opportunities to contribute to future research projects that we are currently developing, as well as our strategy that we are revisiting in the second quarter of this year. So I'm not going to go through the whole background of Race for 2030, but I give you a taste here of the programs that we have. We have 4 under Race for 2030. And again, I'm the Race for Business program leader, so I am a quarter of this pie, and I'm presenting on behalf of the others as well. So thanking them for their contributions. But we, again, are focused on a customer-centered clean energy transition. So in the business program, it's about business energy productivity. In the homes program, it's about affordable energy for clean homes. In the networks program, we're looking at distributed or customer energy resources and the impact of them on the network. And finally, our Race for Everyone program that brings it all together is focused on customer energy, clean energy transition. So I know at various points in time you're asked to provide keywords, so I thought I would translate our themes, our 17 themes, into a number of keywords. So in case that is helpful for you to understand where you live in this program of work or these programs of work, you can see how you can engage with us. So as John has mentioned previously, we do have a demand-side focus. So you'll see references there to flexible demand and distributed energy resources, consumer energy resources, but we also have some technology focuses. We are looking at electric vehicles, industrial process heating, Industry 4.0, which includes artificial intelligence, smart sensors, different smart algorithms, and quite a lot of social science as well, which feeds through our programs, but is also quite a focus for our Race for Everyone program that looks at trust, planning, foresighting, and our clean energy workforce, of which you've heard quite a lot at this conference today, I'm really pleased to see. So to give you a sense of what we are doing now, I wanted to highlight 4 of the major projects that we have already underway. 3 of them are in my program because I always find it easier to present on what I know best. But in fact, the first one here I would highlight as well, which is about to kick off. It's on strategic electric vehicle integration. And luckily, they changed the program. So Scott Dwyer is not actually presenting now, he's presenting next. So I would encourage you to see that session if you have the opportunity. In fact, you've already heard from Alexander Akimov, who will be leading our Business PowerFlex program in the business program that is looking at business customer solutions to minimum demand. So we talked about the duck curve, filling the belly of the duck with good demand from our business, commercial and industrial customers. We also have an exciting project here at UTS on campus led by Arno Castel, which is focused on something completely different, which is embodied carbon, so low energy and carbon cement, and that's in partnership with Boral. So that is another exciting opportunity for us to make a big impact. And finally, I think we also have Ian McGill maybe here, who is leading our 24/7 renewables program with Anna Bruce, who may not be in this session, but I believe is chairing another, so should be here today. And they are doing exciting work developing tools to match renewable energy purchases with business demand. So I'd encourage you to reach out to them to learn more about those projects. So I thought next, rather than going into those projects in detail, because you have an opportunity to hear from them, listen to them afterwards, read the abstracts, and hopefully actually meet the people here, what I might talk to you about is what a great project looks like. And this is one of the lessons that we've learned over our first couple of years of engagement and development of major projects. so that this gives you a sense that if you would like to come to us and bring your projects, these are some of the principles that we have found make the most effective, most impactful industry-led research projects. So as I said, industry-led, this is because we are a cooperative research centre, and so those who are familiar with the CRC program would know that these projects must be industry-led. So here as an example, Alexander, I'm just ripping up your project here, which is the Business Power Flex pilots. This project actually was born out of a conversation with Powerlink in Queensland, and they proposed the problem that we needed to solve, and then the industry partners and research partners, of which you can see here, worked together to co-design this project. And that happened over a substantial period of time, but we're now bringing in processes to bring that within half a year, that we can go from concept to project commencement using that same process. Again, this project, I would say another element of it is that it's focusing on piloting or commercialising an innovative solution. So as we've heard today, that the technologies that we need already exist, this is putting it into practice. So we are focused, and we don't have necessarily a technology or commercial maturity cut off, but we are looking for those projects, and I'll go to my last point here, that will have a significant impact by 2030, beyond, but also by 2030, because that is our lifespan. We have as well with these pilots, we're working across 3 different jurisdictions, and so that is also important to us as well, to be showing that we are, again, a cooperative research centre working across jurisdictions, and you'll see that we have 2 state government partners there as well. So what is next? I'd like to draw your attention to 3 other projects that are very close to kicking off in our programs as well, and these ones are outside the Race for Business program as well, and so I would encourage you to reach out to those program leaders who are here today in case you are interested in learning more about that. We are well and truly underway. We're focused on our priorities, and these are 3 examples of 3 active projects that we have that are supporting those priorities that hopefully will be up and running in the first quarter of this year. The first you may have heard yesterday, presented by Jenny Gregory, which is energy upgrades for Australian homes, looking at equitable pilots to kickstart millions of upgrades to existing homes. No small feat. Second, in our Race for Everyone program, we are looking at net zero precincts. We have a lot of interest in this space and are really excited to be looking at different case studies to show a step change in efforts to decarbonise Australian precincts, and I think that was flagged earlier in the conference about how precinct models are really interesting and innovative and a good place to be researching. And finally, in the Networks program, and I believe actually Stuart Johnson is chairing a session concurrently with this one, but I would encourage you as our Race for Networks program leader to reach out to him if you are interested in low voltage network visibility, because it's also a critical piece of the puzzle to be able to see at that level of the network, and that project is focused on developing roadmaps, guidelines and case studies to better integrate DER or CER. Oh, I've gone over time. All right, we have some, thank you. We're also in the process of developing some concepts, so I just want to throw these ones up here. You can come back to it later, it will be in the program. But these are 4 other areas across 3 of our programs that we're currently conceptualising research, so please reach out to us. We would really welcome your input on these topics. In particular, if you have industry partners that would like to work on these topics, we recognise that existing partnerships are highly productive, so we are welcoming new partners in. So if there is an industry partner that is working on one of those topics or something else that you think falls within our remit, we would really love to hear from you. And our partner team has worked hard to restructure our partnership onboarding process so it is easier to bring industry partners on for major projects. So talk to me, talk to John, he's up the back, talk to Tracy, she's here too, Stuart's here, Jenny's here, we're all here ready to work with you from now and beyond. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny. Great overview. Packed a lot in. So I would now like to, well, first of all, if there's a particular question for Danny, the mic is open. Please come up and to ask your question. And while we're finding that first question, I'd like to invite Dylan and Alexander and Shell to also join us on the panel here. We were scheduled to finish at 1:15, but I propose we take another 5 or 10 minutes with your indulgence to give you an opportunity to engage with what has been presented by our 4 excellent speakers. So, any particular questions for Danny on Race for 2030 and what it's been up to? And if not, I'll open the floor to questions from other people. Yeah, Frank? And again, please identify yourself for the benefit of our online.
So on the topic of institutions for national energy market and that kind of thing, so Dylan, Alexander in particular. Dylan, I felt your talk was sort of almost
And
more
Frank, if you don't mind, just introducing yourself.
Frank Yotzo, ANU, hello. Dylan, your talk was almost more like the introduction to a talk. And so can you tell us a little bit more about your conclusions, right? So you're calling for the ESB to be put to sleep and for AEMO to be split. Surely there's actually even more on your wish list, possibly.
That's not enough for you, Frank?
I'm sort of in two minds about this on a number of levels. So first of all, we often hear about how the next 8 years is going, or 10 years, or we've got 86 months until this transition needs to be done, kind of thing. So there's a question of timing, and so what are we trying to design? What are we designing for? What are we optimizing for? Are we optimizing for doing something in the next 8 years, or are we optimizing for what comes after that? That's a sort of foundational question, because these things will take any of the things I've proposed, even though the sort of quick things that I've proposed would take an inordinate amount of time, I think, given the pace of change in the sector. So part of me thinks the next 8 years or 10 years is just going to be very messy. We've just got to grin and bear it, and then as we're doing this, try and co-design a system that makes sense in the new world, rather than necessarily trying to design the perfect governance framework for a transition that is hopefully time limited. So there's sort of, that's sort of why it's like, well, maybe we don't need to. Maybe we just need to accept that, the next period is going to be messy and not very coordinated necessarily, or efficient, or elegant. That's one approach. But I think fundamentally, there's so some of this work was the earlier work was done with Anne Callies from who's now at RMIT, who I thought was here, but I don't think I've seen her yet. And there's sort of this other. The sort of underlying context and broader challenge here is the constitutionality of the energy system, or the legal foundation of the energy system. This is more of in her domain, as she's a legal scholar, and it's always been the case that states have constitutional responsibility for energy, and actually until recently the federal government did very little in the national electricity market, and I suspect they perhaps wish they left it that way. There's a few things that they have done that have reinserted them into the space, particularly with the ACCC, default market offer, a few other sort of things, and maybe that's complicated things. I'm not sure, but there's actually there's a sort of a broader problem with the competitive or cooperative federalist system. So,
Dylan, we might need to wrap it up. It's a fairly comprehensive answer.
So there's a spectrum of potential interventions that go from very little to constitutional reform.
Okay, Danny wanted to respond as well.
I was just going to ask a very specific question that, given that the research organisations that you work on, you mentioned Anne Callies, who I think maybe called in yesterday, so is not here in person. Is there a way that you could build a new project to investigate that, and who would you partner with for potentially a project that you would submit to Race for 2030?
That's a good question that I haven't put any thought to, and I could not think who appropriate partners might be.
Okay, it sounds like an open invitation to the researchers in the room. Okay, Ian, I held you up earlier, so please go ahead.
Ian McGill, University of New South Wales. Follow-up question for Danny on that. Which race partners would we get attributions from to do that sort of project?
That, I think, probably was the crux of my question. I do think that we have some themes that are related to this, particularly around planning and DSO, and there is an interest, but the idea of gathering enough momentum of the industry partners that we have to back up a project is an important thing to think. It does need to be industry-led, but we have had a lot of support from our government partners in some of these spaces as well. We do have quite a few state government partners, and the network partners as well have expressed interest. Though, of course, you then need to tread the fine line of competing interests, but I think that would be, if you could do it, it would be a very interesting project.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can imagine network businesses getting on board for that sort of project, maybe state governments. I just also want to pick up on one other thing you raised, which, if I understood correctly, is you're revisiting strategy next quarter.
That's
after
right.
2.5 years process of developing strategy.
It's not to say that we will be kickstarting another series of opportunity assessments, which I took in your last comment in the presentation. It is a sense check. We understand that we have had some time with Race for 2030 now, and that we set our milestones, for instance, at the project proposal stage, which was submitted 4 years ago. And so revisiting that with the board to make sure that we are still on track with what's relevant and most impactful is what we are most interested to know from you as our partners. So if you had input for that, where if you think that there is something we could be focusing on, that would be really helpful.
I think my input right now would be less on strategy and more on just getting projects going.
Absolutely.
So,
and I would agree, and that's definitely the message that we want to convey, is that we are very much focused on large, major projects that will have a big impact, because we do have impact commitments that I didn't present on in detail, but they are substantial, in the order of 20 megatons of carbon emissions and $3.9 billion of economic benefit that we need to demonstrate to the Commonwealth by 2030, and the way that we need to do that is by significant research projects. So yes, absolutely.
and some creative accounting, I think, for those targets. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ian. Do we have any other questions from the floor? Yes, please.
From Climate Work Centre and Monash Sustainable Development Institute. Maybe I'll actually have two questions, one for Danny and one for Shell, perhaps. You're just following on to what Ian just mentioned. Well, it's impressive Race 2030 put together such a fantastic research portfolio, but everyone seemed to be chasing money from the same pool of organizations, so it can be challenging. I guess, in that sense, yes, so what other strategies do you think the project team should pursue to really start doing all this research work?
And do you mean for the your team in particular, the strategy with engaging with Race for 2030, or more broadly with some of the other?
More broadly, I guess there is a huge portfolio of projects supported by Race for 2030, while require huge commitment from industry as well. So industry is only that big. I guess everyone's chasing the same pot of money, so it can be challenging sometimes. So what would be the best strategy to maybe stand out? I guess, of course, it depends on stakeholders as well, but any advice will be very welcome. So.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I would say with Race for 2030, I know that we don't have all the money, but we do have a significant resource to invest in research. That's why we exist. I think, as Ian maybe pointed out, is that we have a model in which we have to demonstrate that industry is leading the development of the projects that we fund. And so in terms of strategy, I would encourage you to either bring partners that you have worked with in industry to us, or work with industry partners that are already within Race for 2030 to develop projects, or align with the priorities that we've already heard from industry, some of which I put up today, and express your interest in those spaces if they make sense for you, and then we can make the connections with other key researchers. As I was kind of mentioning before with Dylan and Anne, like if you're working in the same space, let's build something together and find that as a priority area. We recognise that you're stretched as researchers in Australia, and we really appreciate you've got a small amount of time, and you need to be able to be sure that you'll be more sure that you'll be successful. And it is somewhat of a competitive landscape, but I'd say with Race for 2030, the benefit of that is that it's somewhat of a collaborative landscape, and we're finding that there's plenty of pie for everyone.
Just quickly adding on what you said, the development that you don't have to have the partners which are partners of Race, the project-only partners. It's a new development. So you know, if you're struggling to find proponents of the project within current partners, maybe reaching out to someone else who's outside of Race but is prepared to contribute financially into the project and bring them as a project-only partner. So I think it's a good development and have potential to sort of expand a little bit my ability to fund the project.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. The second question is to Shell. I guess thank you very much. I guess very interesting you compared.
If you just speak into the mic, please.
Yeah, green banks from different countries. I'm just wondering, through your research, are there insights in terms of how these green banks set up their investment criteria, based on what? And any insights maybe, are there any impacts on the private investment based on the threshold or criteria they set for these green banks? That would be very appreciated.
Yeah, so thanks so much for that question. So yeah, that's been a focus definitely of my research. So I think with regards to the first part of that question, which is, you know, the, sorry, I'll just, sorry, so, sorry, I've just heard, could you just repeat, like, yeah, so just, sorry, I've just gone blank. Sorry, investment criteria. So the key, like, investment criteria that they have is generally, also for Australia, like our legislation, the SoERC Act has, you know, three sort of categories. So is it renewable energy, energy efficient, or low carbon sort of technologies, and they outline very specifically what investments are allowed. The same, so New Zealand and New York green banks also have specific sort of technologies that they outline. And Australia, in addition to having prescribed technologies, they also have some technologies that are banned, such as nuclear and CCS. So all of the green banks that I have studied, noting again that they are in mature liquid financial markets, they all have risk and audit committees, and so they all of their investments undergo very stringent sort of ESG screening processes. And in terms of the second part of your question, the impact on private investment, I think, one of the key conclusions that this research, or I've reached with this research, is that the green banks have actually had a very sort of positive impact on, educating the private sector in how to screen for sort of green investment or technology. Green investments more effectively. So they're sort of the leading sort of financial actors in the market. They have the most sort of robust and rigorous processes, and they've been very helpful in showing, particularly say some of the other sort of commercial banks, how they can sort of assess the risks of new technologies in a more effective way. So I think largely it's been very positive in each of the jurisdictions I've looked at. So yeah, sorry.
Okay, thank you, Shell. I'm not seeing any more hands, probably a few grumbling tummies out there, so I might let you go to lunch now. But before we do, can we just finally, again, once more, thank our wonderful presenters in Danny, Cheryl, Alexander and Dylan. And thank you for your attention.